Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much, Chair, and many thanks. Just wanted to come back on something that Professor Arthur said earlier. You mentioned this Brexit mitigation committee that I think you're involved in, and I think you said it's met 40 times since, I don't know, since the referendum, or whenever that might be. Since the referendum, yeah. So I was just wondering if all of the panellists could give a sense of how much of your time is now being absorbed into dealing with the fallout of the 23rd of June 2016 referendum. If you had to put roughly speaking, a number of hours in a week that you're spending on dealing with this rather than dealing with your business as usual, would you be able to put an estimate of percentage, for example, of time?
Well, I'll start whilst the others think. I would describe it as being very intensive in the early phases after the referendum, largely around all of the people issues. And it's really difficult to explain, but literally Europeans crying in my office type levels of emotion.
Yeah.
And lots of anxiety about futures and families and access to healthcare and the sort of things that matter in you feeling stable in your environment and work. So the human impact stuff consumed a lot of hours of a lot of leaders in the institution, and I think we would be running into hundreds to thousands of hours in that initial phase. About 20% of my staff are EU citizens. EU students as well, of course, deeply upset. And then over time, of course, it has lessened. So my Brexit mitigation group, which was meeting weekly, now meets monthly. And we put in the occasional emergency meeting if something else happens that we need to think through. It's quite a high-powered group. I mean, it involves some of my vice provosts, some of my deans, my key directors of HR, finance, etc. So, we are really trying to manage that level of uncertainty as best we can. So I think the answer is it's very significant, but I couldn't give you a precise number of hours. Fortunately, they don't clock my hours in that way.
Yeah.
Actually, perhaps it would be to my advantage if they did.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting you send the committee a timesheet or anything like that.
Really different perspective. I heard from a digital company that engages in a lot of these framework programs that we've talked about. They're actually a US-owned company with a presence in London and a presence in mainland Europe. And they described a conversation after the referendum in which they met for about 10 minutes and, talked about, as I mentioned earlier, this business risk mitigation. So there was a little bit of, oh, goodness, what should we do now? And then a business risk decision, which they made very rapidly, which was simply that they were going to have to increase their base in mainland Europe in order to have a reasonable kind of business plan going forward that meant that they would still be able to engage in all the programs that we've heard about. So I think across the different sorts of organisations I deal with, there's a full range of answers to your question, from very deep involvement to some which just because of the nature of their business have to make quick decisions. And I think that ties into the point that Professor Brooke made earlier about some of the consequentials are happening now simply because people have to make choices.
This is a very subjective assessment. So me personally, I would say it's about a third of my time. For our individual members, there will have been some quite serious discussions at board level and senior management level about strategy. I can go and ask roughly what the impact has been, but I don't have a figure. I think HR departments have been very heavily involved in the process of reassuring staff, and that has taken very considerable time and a lot of staff meetings. I know one member who has taken the decision to establish themselves outside the UK, and they said to me that £1 million of investment, which they were proposing to put into a facility up in the northeast, has now gone to Ireland. So that kind of decision has been taken at board level. I would imagine, well, I think the decision was fairly quick because they have no alternative, unless they're going to take a major risk with losing future business. I would guess, again, a third, for want of a better number, maybe a third of board time would be concerned with Brexit issues, and sometimes more, sometimes less. But it is a significant amount.
Yes.
I can be very brief, I think. So Wellcome doesn't receive any funding from the EU, and our funding is independent of the EU. So our role on Brexit is rather different, and we're focused on making sure that we can get the best possible deal for science. That said, my team is focused on making sure that we have a great environment to do research in, and clearly Brexit poses significant challenges within that we have to mitigate. So we are, as a team, spending a significant amount of time, but that's not mitigation activities in terms of Wellcome's own business.
Great, thank you very much. I just wanted to get on to then the design of Framework Programme 9. And one question I had is, I mean, you mentioned that I think it was Professor Arthur, that you've been out in Brussels working on the design of Framework Programme 9, involved in inputting to it, as the UK has always been since its membership of the EU started, and since these programmes started. But have you noticed any change in the dynamics of the relationship and the extent to which the UK is being able to influence the shaping of the programme?
Well, to be clear, we've not been directly involved in discussion of the design. We have submitted evidence, if you like, and our view as the Russell Group, and that's been quite well received. It's also been quite well received and has shaped the British government's view as they enter the negotiations. How can I best describe the reception one gets? Most meetings start with a level of incredulity at what we're doing, and you know, some requests for us to try and explain what's going on and where we've got to, which is always kind of difficult because we don't know the detail. But what I would definitely say is very, very strong support for continued British involvement in European science from all of the officials, from the Research Directorate and from the Commission. And Commissioner Modesh in particular is really clear about his desire to continue to see strong UK involvement in Framework 9, all of the instruments and beyond Framework 9 as well. And he has obviously been pushing for his sort of catchphrase, which is open science, open innovation and open to the world. And he wants to see many other countries involved with European research and innovation, and begins to describe our future as being one of the leaders in that bracket of other countries that will be involved in the EU. So, you know, we hope from the Russell Group that we can move through to an overarching agreement. Presumably there will be, first of all, the framework agreement in October, and then the more detailed work in the transition period. The science elements of this, I think, are fairly straightforward, with a couple of issues, not least of which is the mobility issue, which we've already discussed, that intersects with our ability to be effective in European research. So we find really strong support, and we find that, by the way, from all of the major European agencies, research agencies, Max Planck, CNRS, etc., and we find it from our collaborating universities, from the rectors. They've all been making representations to their government that European science is significantly diminished if we're not involved. So it's definitely a win-win. Europe gains a huge amount by our continued involvement. We gain a huge amount by our participation. And to our mind, by the way, that isn't just about FP9 in its narrow sense. It's about all of the instruments. It's about innovation. It's about Marie Sklodowska-Curie, and it's about Erasmus and student exchange. So we think we need a package that provides that continued arrangement as an associated country, but where that association agreement is tailored to the nature of what you can bring, and recognises the value that we bring. And that's what I think Commissioner Modesh means when he says open to the world. I think he wants to see different arrangements with different countries to bring them into that level of excellence.
So, yes, Dr. Thompson.
This concept of an association agreement and being an associated country within FP9 is really important, particularly because we're in the middle of drafting legislation at the moment. And this is not something that we're looking for a completely new departure in the way the EU works. There have always been associated countries within those EU programmes, like Switzerland and like Norway, like Israel. So therefore, we need to make sure that that FP9 legislation creates a route for the UK to participate in that. Under the current Horizon 2020 legislation, it wouldn't be clear how the UK would engage. So I think it's really important that we take the goodwill that and we hear exactly the same as Professor Arthur from funding organisations, from the research community across Europe, and turn that into a clear political path that will take us towards an association agreement. We can't have that association agreement until the framework programme legislation is finalised, so that's some way away. But it would be very helpful as soon as possible to have clarity on what that deal might look like and where we're heading, and not least to make sure that the framework programme legislation creates a clear route for the UK to participate. And we think that everyone agrees with that principle.
So thank you. It's very useful to hear from the panel that your clear view is that in terms of that overall political path, as you call it, the association agreement path it sounds like the only one that you could see working in terms of that overarching agreement, and then more specifically for your context. My final question, though, is you've said that one of the sort of upsides of Brexit is that it's forced you to think more globally and not just to sort of default to the relationship with the EU. But can you see any scenario whereby that advantage could potentially outweigh the disadvantages of disrupting the relationship with the EU that Brexit has caused?
A very brief answer from any one of you would...
No. Okay, thank you very much. That's fine.